Welcome to Mysterious Goings On. I'm Alex Greenwood. You know, one thing I've learned knocking around the planet low these many decades is that there are no good guys and not as many bad guys as you might think. People are, instead, often defined by the lines people cross to achieve their aims. That's why today I'm excited to venture into the last frontier of Alaska, where author Russell Heath has set Rens Crossing, a high-stakes, high-octane dive into the gritty political battles that have ripped Alaska apart since statehood. Russell's pretty interesting. In his teens, he hitchhiked to Alaska and lived in a cabin on the banks of the Tanana River. In his 20s, he lived in Italy, then traveled overland across the Sahara, through the jungles and over the savannas of Africa and into southern Asia. In his 30s, he sailed alone around the world in a 25-foot wooden boat. In his 40s, he wrote novels, and in his 50s, he bicycled the spine of the Rockies from Alaska to Mexico. He's worked on the Alaska Pipeline as an environmental lobbyist in the Alaska legislature and run a storied environmental organization fighting to protect Alaska's coastal rainforests. In 2010, apparently wanting more frenzy in his life, he moved to New York City, where he dug deep into leadership development and coaching. He now lives in a cabin on the coast of Maine, coaching businesses and nonprofit leaders intent on making big things happen in the world. Today, let's ask Russell Heath to be our guide into the wilds. Russell, welcome to Mysterious Goings On.
Hey, Alex, great to be here.
Your bio reads like kind of an Indiana Jones kind of thing. You apparently were imbued with wanderlust from a very early age.
Yeah, well, wanderlust or running away, you're never quite sure. And yeah, and it's it's a question people often ask me is why do I wander? And I don't know. I just think it's the particular hormones that are floating around in my bloodstream over which I have no control unless they come from oatmeal or something. So yes, I've got a lot more places that I like to visit as well before I shuffle off my mortal coil here.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Alaska if we could settle in here, which is the setting for Rens Crossing. Was it your initial, sojourn into Alaska? Did that just kind of set itself into your mind, into your psyche, and and then since you spent so much time working there as well, was it just natural to set the novel there?
Well, natural, I suppose. I mean, I didn't really have a choice. It was really the only place I knew, and I spent most of my adult life in Alaska, but the thing too is that I knew the Alaska legislature really, really well. And, I'd be curious, in your experience with mystery and thrillers, whether you know of another legislative thriller, a thriller that goes through a state or federal legislature. I don't think there is one, and certainly not in Alaska, but I couldn't have written about any other legislature because it was only the Alaska legislature that I knew.
Well, there is the novels that was done by the late host of the PBS NewsHour, set in Oklahoma, my home state, where in the hero or the 2 or 3 novels was the lieutenant governor. And my gosh, I'm blanking. I used to be a PBS executive, and I've met this gentleman, and he passed away a couple of years ago. Oh my word, I'm embarrassed. But he did write a series based on the Oklahoma State Capitol of Mysteries. Okay, but I would say, yeah, that's the only other thing I can think of that has anything to do with the state legislature.
Oh, well, I'll have to track him down. Yeah.
When I remember something here, it's tough being in my 50s during COVID. I don't remember much, but I will send that to you and let you check that out. Yeah. Yeah. I actually have a little bit of a background too. I ran for legislature in Oklahoma a few times. And I also was a lobbyist for a little while too. So I am particularly interested in your stuff too. And then the last thing I can tell you that's a little bit of a hook, when I was 14 in high school, they had a program called Close Up where you go to DC, right? You heard of Close Up?
Used to run it.
Oh my, you did?
I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I worked for a firm where we had the contract to run the close-up program in Alaska.
Okay, then you're not going to guess who my roommates were.
Oh, Tony Knowles.
It could have been. My roommates, though, were Alaska kids. I was the Oklahoma contingent, and our roommates were the Alaska kids.
What year was this?
Okay, I would have been 14. I'm 52 now, so 82 or 3, I guess.
Okay, so I'm a little older than you. I was working in that firm in my 20s, which was in the 70s then. No, I take that back. It was the 80s. I was there in the 80s. Maybe I would have known some of those kids.
I bet you did. I mean, it bothers me that I can't seem to find all the, because we'll keep in touch, but I'd love to find a couple of them because I just remember it was just a great experience. But anyway, so those are my little connections into your world, and I'll stop talking about me here. This is not about me, but I just found that's why I was particularly excited when I learned about your work. Was I thought I have all these touch points in my life that seem to fit here. So that said, I want to ask you a couple of questions just in general about Alaska before we can get deeper into the book, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. And bearing in mind that what I know about Alaska is that and, some television programs. But what are the most common misconceptions people have about Alaska as far as you're concerned, people who don't live there?
Oh, you mean like it gets cold there? Well, that's a good question. I don't know what the common misconception would be. It does get cold there. Unfortunately, it's getting much warmer over the last, and it's much warmer in Alaska, percentage-wise, and it is in the rest of the country because the Arctic or the poles, the Arctic and the Antarctic, are warming more quickly than the temperate regions. And so much of our infrastructure is based on cold that it stops working when it gets warm. But that's a good question. I don't know what it would be. I would say two things. When I went up to Alaska, so I hitchhiked up there in 1974, and then we were really isolated. So like they would fly up the Walter Cronkite tapes from the CBS Evening News. So we would watch Walter Cronkite the day after. So our news was already 24 hours old by the time we saw the CBS Evening News. And now, of course, Alaska is just completely cooked in to the rest of the country and the internet, as is any other community in Alaska and the United States. It's not isolated in that way. In fact, most of the native villages have broadband going right into the villages.
Fantastic.
High quality broadband, yeah.
Yeah.
But what would I say? Well, there's sand dunes. I don't think most people realize that there's about 300 square miles of sand dunes, almost in the Arctic Circle.
Had no idea. No idea.
All righty, there's a misconception unveiled.
There you go. Well, that's good. The reason I ask that is because when people pick up your book, I have a feeling they're going to be in for a bit of an education. And part of that education stems from what I think you just said is that, we're not a day behind anymore, so to speak. We're different. But I think that the conception I have, let me just throw a conception or two at you. And I have a dear friend who was a former newscaster in Alaska as well. And she kind of set me straight on some things years ago. And she said, of course we're a rugged people. We obviously, you don't choose to live a place that has so little sunlight certain times of the year. If you're kind of a panty waist or whatever you want to call it, there is definitely a ruggedness and a strength to it, but I think it's an overstatement and oversimplification to say that, isn't it? I mean, there's still, as I in my intro said, there's people who are, one way or another, but we're all human there, I guess is the point. Not everybody there is a mountain man is probably one of the things.
No, absolutely true. So half the people live in the Anchorage area. Anchorage, of course, is the largest city there, and so of the 750,000 people who live in Alaska, half of them live in a metropolitan area. And in fact, here's a misconception. Alaska is the most urbanized state in the Union. A higher percentage of people live in cities in Alaska than in any other state. And Vermont's the most rural. So, and one of the reasons, of course, is that as soon as you get out of the main city, you have very few services,
Hmm.
almost none. And it doesn't take you very long to get off the grid entirely. So it's very difficult to live outside of metropolitan areas.
Oh, well, I totally did not know that. Well, let's talk a little bit about the background for the novel, then the legislative background. Now, you lobbied the Alaska State Legislature on behalf of environmental concerns. And by the way, I just read some very disturbing stuff about what Trump wants to do to Tongass. Open it up, right? Is that the latest thing?
But
Um,
yeah, he has already done that. So there's a rule in all of the nation's national forests that wilderness areas or areas that don't have roads can't have new roads built into them. So it's called the Roadless Rule. And that's been around since, oh boy, more than 20 years, I think now. And the Tongass was the last national forest to be included in that rule. And it was a big fight to include it in that rule. So now he's exempted the national forest again from the rule. So new roads can be built into roadless areas for the purposes of logging.
yeah, it's disturbing, but is this what we're up against every time there's a new president? If they just want to, with the stroke of a pen, say we're going to exempt these things, is that really how vulnerable the forests are?
Well, you can certainly see that and I don't want to get too political here, but certainly a lot of what Trump has done in his 4 years in office has been to undo what the previous administration has done. And yes, you're speaking on a larger issue. It's easy for a president or an executive to order something through an executive order or through some kind of regulatory procedure that hasn't gone through the legislature. But when you do it that way, then it's very easy for the next guy to come along and undo it. So actually, I was part of the fight. I was running another organization, Southeast Alaska Conservation Council, when there was the fight to bring the Tongass into the roadless rule. And my objection at the time was that I said that this would be undone as soon as we get another Republican president. That what we really needed to do is do the hard work of having a legislative bill pass which protected areas, these wilderness areas. And that would be a decade-long campaign. I mean, that would take a long time to have happen. But once it's happened, it would not be undone.
Yeah. So put in all the hard work at the beginning, so you're not constantly dealing with this every other administration practically. Yeah, it makes sense. Makes sense.
But if I could just interrupt just for a moment, Alex, this rule won't stand. I mean, what Trump has done now is he's fighting, last year's war or the last war. And the cultural shift in Southeast Alaska is such, and the infrastructure isn't there really to support large scale logging like there was back in the 90s and the 80s, 60s.
Oh.
Yeah. So I don't think, I think in the long term that this rule is just a dead letter.
Oh, I had no idea. I think, see, there we go. I just make the assumption, oh, well, logging must be pretty simple up there. But yeah, I guess you're right. If you're continuing to diminish that industry, it's not like you can just flip a switch and, oh yeah, we can go log that whole thing right now. Okay, makes sense. And so when you worked with as a lobbyist with the legislature, now does the legislature meet every year or every other year?
No, it's every year.
It's every year now. Okay. And it's bicameral.
Yes.
Okay. But have you found that did you find when you were lobbying the legislature, was it pretty evenly split to if I can be simplistic about Alaskans who wanted to, try to exploit the things that Alaska has, or did you find versus the folks who, no, we want to preserve? Was there a pretty evenly split, or does it just depend?
No, not at all. So Alaska is one of the states in the American Midwest, which are largely dependent on their natural resources. So unlike, say, the economies on the coast, which are much more service oriented, right? Alaska is, like Montana and Wyoming and Nevada, really, really dependent on their natural resources, and certainly oil more than anything. So because the economy is that way, that's the way that the political system is. And so an environmental approaches usually are an uphill battle. And as a lobbyist, most of what I could do was not passing good things, but trying to stop bad things. It's a lot easier in a democracy to stop things from happening than to make things happen.
Very true. Okay. Well, I just wanted to kind of get a little background there as we go into Rens Crossing. If you don't mind, can you give us the blurb here? What's going on in this book?
Okay, so there's a lot going on in this book. I wanted to make a really complex novel that would make you think, right? so 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 the first thing that starts is it was sparked by a fantasy that I had, a number of years ago when the logging in the Tongass was really quite horrific. And that is, I was thinking, well, why don't I just sneak into one of these logging camps and take out all their machinery? Right? These logging camps are 50, 60 miles away from the closest village. There's no security there. It'd be no problem at all to go in there and take out their machinery. All right. And not that it would do any good, because, the industrial onslaught is relentless, and all the machines would just be put back by the next week, but it would be really cathartic. And then I thought, wow, well, what happens if somebody else were accused of my crime? What would I do? And so that was a little bit of the genesis right there. So the opening scene is the main character, Rinn, sabotaging the logging, the equipment of a logging camp. All right. And then his ex-lover gets accused of the crime and of a murder that coincidentally happened on the same evening, the same night. So she's now has a murder charge against her. So Rinn needs to get her off the hook without getting himself on the hook. So that's where he needs to, that's his initial struggle. But then Kit, his ex-lover, right? There's a big legislative battle in the state legislature. So one of the things that has, riven Alaska is that promises were made to the native Alaskans way back when their land claims are settled in 1971. And that promise has never been fulfilled. Even till today, it has not been fulfilled. And that promise was to give the natives first crack at subsistence resources, at hunting, like moose and caribou, when there wasn't enough of the resource to go around. So it's called a subsistence preference. Okay, and you can see that's tremendously controversial within the state. So the legislative battle was to trade the subsistence amendment, which had to be an amendment to the Constitution, with 4 bills that the people that oppose a subsistence amendment wanted. So this is a classic legislative sausage, right? So the people on the left are supportive of the amendment, but the people on the right oppose the amendment but want these bills. Kit, because she's a single issue person here, right? This is the thing. Because she's a single issue person, has to oppose the amendment, because that's the only way she'll stop the 2 environmental bills in that package. All right. So that's a long explanation to say that there's this tremendous legislative battle, and Kit, with a murder charge against her, is in the middle of.
Did you find it tricky when you wrote the book the ins and outs, the political intrigue? Did you find it, though, that it got to a point where it might have been a little, all the ins and outs of how a legislative process works? Did you have to worry about that a little bit, or did you kind of glide over the top, or did you get in the nitty gritty?
So everything that happens in this book could happen in real life. There's no floating over the top. And if your question is, did it get complex? Yes, it got complex. And that was a concern, because, I was thinking of a police procedural where, the police detective goes through all the procedure that he has to do or she has to do in that kind of genre, in a police procedural. So in the same way, I went through a legislative procedural, right? But I had to do it, of course, so that 1, didn't lose the reader, and 2, didn't bore them. That was tricky. That took a bit of practice, bit of work, I'll tell you.
It is tricky. I mean, it really is tricky. That's one of the reasons I could never really, well, not one of many that I couldn't get into Tom Clancy much, was there's just so much minutia, and I don't really need to know how a gun works. I just need to know somebody got shot.
Right.
But I'm also, by the same way, I think that I'm a firm believer, Russell, that readers do like to learn about people's jobs.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care if they're a plumber. I don't care. I have found in my own work that when people read about like a certain thing, and I've done some research, and I've kind of literally I had one about a plumber, and people were like, I had no idea about that old joke about plumbers, paydays on Friday, and don't chew your fingernails and all blah, blah, blah. This is the whole saying that plumbers have. Anyway, I'm blanking on all of it. But I think people enjoy learning about other people's work. And I think that there's a great deal of mystery about how the sausage is made in our own government. So,
well, certainly the reviewers haven't, both the Amazon reviews and the professional reviewers, no one has really said that they got lost in the legislative battle. They all found it very, very compelling. So that was my big relief. That was my big concern about the book. So just, for your listeners, it's a challenging book, but it's a challenging book that will have you just turning pages. It'll drive you right through the story.
Well, and you've got some pretty nice other reviewers here, including a former governor of Alaska. Tony Knowles wrote a very nice review for you. Nice blurb there, huh?
So may I interrupt? Do you know where he was born, Alex?
No, where?
Oklahoma.
Get out of here.
Yeah, that's what I said. I just thought he was your roommate.
This is freaking me out a little bit. Oh, I just thought you meant, because I knew who Tony Knowles was as a governor, but I thought you were saying he was my roommate because it's I had no idea he was from Oklahoma.
Yep.
My gosh. By the way, Jim Lehrer, that's what I'm talking about.
Oh, Jim Lehrer, right.
Jim Lehrer wrote the book. See, there it is. But you also had a state senator, right? Also saying that it was complex, riveting, and right out of the headlines. Heath, who paid his dues with years in Alaska, nails Alaska's zeitgeist. So that's good. That's good to know. So what I'm hearing, of course, is that, you've got the intricacies of legislation and the ins and outs and all that, the intrigue there, but you're imbuing the book with all this good flavor that serves as the backdrop for the moral issue here. That Rinn's got to deal with, he did this thing, and do I leave my ex-lover hanging out to dry or not?
Well, there are lots of moral issues. I was impressed by your lead-in, your introduction here, crossing the line, because one of the things I wanted to point out, or one of the things I really wanted to struggle with in the novel, is that, most of us in our day-to-day lives live really low-stake lives. We don't have much at stake. We live in a super safe, by historical standards, a super safe environment. We all know most of us know that we're going to have food on the table tonight. We know that our kids, when we send them off to school, COVID aside, right, they're going to come home in the evening, right? So it's really easy to follow the law and be ethical and moral when the stakes are low. But what do you do when the stakes start ramping up? What do you do when the stakes get higher? At what point do you say, for the benefit of my family or my career or whatever, I step over the line? And so there are 4 characters in Rens Crossing. 3 are friends and one's an antagonist, but all 4 of them step over the line, and all 4 of them betray each other because they're all headed in different directions in some way. So this is the real complexity of the novel, is the moral decisions that they make, and the fact that they make them at the expense of their friends.
I came across this understanding about this. I grew up in a situation, don't worry, I'm not going to psychoanalyze myself here, but I grew up in a situation where I had to learn as an adult that I have very black and white thinking, and people can draw their own conclusions of what kind of upbringing I had that I developed, or things are you're either good or you're bad. But I learned through therapy and things like that, and I'll never forget the therapist saying, Alex, you seem to labor under the misapprehension that there are good people and bad people. They're just people. He says, without being too cliche, life is shades of gray. And Russell, like you just said, like I have a daughter, I have a wife, I have a home, I live a very comfortable life. And I agree with you totally. People say, oh, crime's so horrible in America. It's not comparatively. Historically, we live in a utopia to a large degree. I'm not trying to belittle problems we have, but relatively to history. But what I have learned and what has served me so very well, not only as a human being, but also as a writer, is to also not write these characters who are the mustache twirling villains, because there's if any, there's very few human beings who really look at themselves in the mirror and go, you're a bad person. I just don't think that happens much. Is that kind of where we're getting here? Are we simpatico on that thought?
Yes, totally. And in fact, I'd add to that, even those people who, from our point of view, are villains, I know in their heads, they think they're right, that they have a rationale that explains to them why what they're doing, whether it's raping or bank robbing or whatever, is right. And they usually see themselves as a victim, right? So that they justify their criminality through victimhood.
You know, and I, again, not trying to be political, but we're seeing a lot of grievance culture right now and a lot of people professing victimhood, I think. And that's, I think it's important what you just said, to look at it through that prism, because a lot of these folks feel aggrieved about things, and people who disagree with them politically or socially are like, oh, come on. You know, here, I'll throw it back on what you said. We live relatively in the greatest circumstance humankind has ever lived in. And you have grievances about this stuff? But it's back to what you said, right? They're looking in the mirror and they're saying, this has been taken from me. This is endangering my way of life. Oh, man. It's human behavior. It is quite a thing to explore.
And I don't think there's anything unusual. I think this is part of who we are. But the tendency always, always, always is to look through a lens of victimhood. And there's a thing that, you know, you can say legitimately, for instance, say African Americans can see themselves as victims in the society, or, you know, a woman who's been beaten by her husband or raped on the street. You know, you can say, yes, there's some victimhood there. But what's key is that if you don't start looking at what happens to you from a different point of view than victimhood, then the pain that you've experienced from that crime is going to be transmitted. So pain not transformed is pain transmitted. And that's the danger of looking at whatever's happened to you, whatever your circumstances in life, through a lens of victimhood. So I know we're getting a little away from Rens Crossing. I just need to say that I'm a life coach and I deal with this on like a daily basis.
Well, and I knew that, and I kind of thought I'd get a little free advice from you on that one. But just to move us back to the book, I'll just say this, though. I think you're 100% correct. And I think it was when I started realizing that I need to transition. I don't have to necessarily transform as a human, but I do need to transition away from the things that weren't good, and not view my life as a victim of something. So I think that's really important. Now let's talk a little bit about writing for a second here, because I'm watching the clock. I know I don't have you forever here, because I've got a question towards the end. I've got to ask you about your adventured life. I've got to, but let's talk about the writing aspect, though. Now this is not your first book. You've had a few books out, and some of them actually have garnered some really excellent critical praise, and I believe Rens Crossing is doing as well. Do you enjoy the process of writing, or do you find it tedious? Just the basic writer's question. How do you feel about writing itself?
All right. Can I tell you a story?
Please.
All right. So, you know, I wanted to be a writer, you know, in the same way that I wanted to be president or, you know, a rock star or a supermodel or whatever. And every time I got started, and, you know, I would get started before there were computers, you know, I'd have this blank piece of paper in front of me, and by lunchtime I'd given up. There's no way that I knew how to move forward. And then it was back in the mid to late 90s. I was kayaking around this big island in southeast Alaska. It's called Baranof Island. It was a 3-week kayak trip to get around that island. And I was with a friend, and she read a mystery story by a local Alaskan author. And when she finished it, I said, was it any good? And she said, oh yeah, it's really great. So I read it, and it was terrible. And it was beyond dreadful. It was appalling. And I said, Irene, you told me this was great. This stinks. And she said, yeah, I know. I said, well, I didn't want to influence your opinion. I said, well, I want my opinion influenced. I don't I spent hours of my life. I wasted hours of my life reading this Shrek. And then right at that point, I said, I can do better, which is the ultimate hubris, right? Of the guy who doesn't have a clue what he's getting into. And so it was at that point I was committed to writing a book. And, the problem was, well, I spent the next year with that blank piece of paper. So how do you get started? And because what I'd read was a mystery story, I said, okay, I'll write a mystery story. And I didn't know how to get started. And I mean, it was comical. And then I remembered a book I'd read recently by Jane Smiley called 1,000 Acres, right? And that won the Pulitzer Prize. But you're halfway through it and you realize it's a scene-by-scene ripoff of King Lear. I said, wait a minute, she should have been hauled off to jail for plagiarism, but no, she gets a Pulitzer Prize. Well, I'll do that. I'll just find some playwright who's dead, is not going to come after me, if I steal his best stuff. So I'd start chewing around, what's a good play to steal. And I realized, well, the first mystery in Western canon is Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. And Sophocles has been dead for 2.5 millennium, so I'm probably pretty safe. And so my first book, Broken Angels, it wasn't a scene-by-scene ripoff, but it started the process of how do I turn Oedipus Rex into a story that happens in Alaska. And I'm getting to your point here. And I was so convinced that I would give up on this story. It's like my 100th diet, right? Yet again, I want to lose another 5 pounds. And yet again, by the next day, I'm chowing down on the Twinkies. I was so timid, so tentative about getting started that I limited myself to just working a few hours a day, and then I had to quit. So I had a deadline when I had to quit. And that's what I did for the first, 3 or 4 months. I just write a couple hours a day and then I quit. And then I write a few more hours and then I quit. And it was about a year before I started realizing, hey, this is kind of fun. And it had taken over my mind. I'd be working on the plot and how do you develop this character? And then all of a sudden it was full day. It was all day. And I'd be exhausted by the end of it. So it was, I had to lead myself into this really, really slowly because I tried so many times in the past and failed so many times that I had no real hope that I would see the project through.
Yeah. Yet, Broken Angels was a finalist for the best independently published mystery.
It was.
How did that do anything for you when you got that?
Oh, I was so pissed off. You know what the psychology of the silver medal winner is. There's been a lot of researches that the person who wins a silver medal in the Olympics, his or her life is ruined because they think if I just gone 0.001% faster, you would have gotten the gold. Whereas the bronze person is really happy because at least they were in the color, right? At least they were on the podium. So yeah, so. You don't want to come in second ever.
That's what
I'm just joking. I was quite pleased. It was my first book after all.
It was your first book? Yeah, I was going to say. No, but I've been there. I've had several of my books get honorable mention or, whatever. And after a while, you're like, okay, yeah. So I understand that feeling that the one time when I actually won first prize on a short story, I dined out on that sucker. Well, wait, what day is it? I've been dining out on that for 12 years. I mean, it's just, I don't care. No, that's fantastic. I was just curious about that. Now, are you somebody who just through the course of your daily life, something hits you and you're like, that's the new book? Or are you more methodical about it than that? Do you think on it and think this is next?
So good question. The first time it was Oedipus Rex that got me started, right? And I knew how Oedipus ended. So I knew how my novel had to end. And I worked backwards from there. Rens Crossing, I knew how the novel ended. I wanted it to end right away, and I knew how I wanted to begin. How it began was sabotaging that logging camp on the one hand, and then I had this this. I knew I had this really interesting material in the Alaskan State Legislature, so I had to meld it all together. So it was a year of thinking that to put that through. It's again, I mean, I'm really quite pleased with the novel because there are 5 different plot lines that go through it. And there are no loose ends. No one's yet said, well, what happened to Joe back here on, page 63? It's all really tightly plotted. But I'm working on a sequel to Broken Angels, the second one. And it took me a couple of years to figure out what it was so the main character is a woman, what it was that Chris Gabriel, who's Alaska Native, is fighting for the second time. So in Oedipus, the Oedipus was a king of Thebes, and what he was fighting for was the truth. But I couldn't have her fight for truth again, she had to fight for something else. So it took a while to figure out what it was that she was fighting for. And once that happened, then I could write the book.
It's that you took the next question right out of my mouth on that. I was curious about that. It's a question I've been asking all of my guests lately is, are you into, creating a series or sequels? Is that something you set out to? Nobody's told me they started out to start a series. Nobody's told me that. But the ones who did write 1 or 2 or 3 mostly said they seem to be capping it around 3 because 3 is a great number. And the feeling was that a lot of the series started petering out sales-wise after 3. Do you put that much thought into going forward, or is it all about, look, I'm just going to tell a good story until I can't tell a good story anymore?
Well, I'd like to say the latter, but I'm coming in on the so as you as an author, we all know that unless we're Tom Clancy, the biggest struggle of being an author is marketing your book and selling it. Right?
Yeah,
it's infinitely more difficult than writing the damn thing, and there are far more authors out there than there are successful. There are far more authors with books out there than with bank accounts that that are hefty enough to pay the mortgage and put some beans on the table. And what I've discovered in my investigation of marketing is that there's a whole subset, and you may have run into this in talking with other authors, but there's a whole I don't want to call it subculture of authors that have learned how to use Amazon specifically to sell their books, and sell their books in such a way that they make a good living, that they in a way that they could not if they went with a traditional route.
Yeah.
In fact, the traditional route is so difficult. My cousin used to be head of Picador, an imprint for Macmillan, and he said, Russell, there are only like 100 people in the country who are making money, supporting themselves on their fiction. I think he was exaggerating, but not, if you take out Stephen King, there are not many left, right? So I don't think the traditional route is the way to go anymore. I think that that the shift in marketing is to do it self-publishing, and we have total creative control, and you can use Amazon. And these people that have discovered how to use Amazon, how to develop a list, how to develop fans, how to use a website, have been really quite successful. And one of the key strategies is to have a series, of books. So, just for example, you use the first 2 books as loss leaders to get the people engaged in the series, and then you raise the price to, again, it's only electronic that they're dealing with, $3 or $4 a copy, or $5 or $6 a copy. And so you build a fan base. And if your series peters out, then you can start another series and bring your fan base over.
Right.
So I'm actually, considering that as an option.
I recommend it. I've got my series is at 7. I'm in the middle of book 8, although sorry listeners who love my series, and thank you. Probably this will be it for a long time. But I have found that the long tail does seem to work, and using the first 2 or 3 couple of books, at least as you say, lost leaders, get your foot in the door and do that. And I don't know about you, but I'd say 85% our ebook now. Hardly anybody buys the paperbacks anymore.
Right.
I guess that's just the way it is. So, but I appreciate you being so candid about that. And I think if you're smart, like you said, if you learn how to not game the system, but use the system, particularly with Amazon, to work for you, you can definitely do these things. Well, okay, I've kept you a good long time, but I've appreciated this, but I got to ask you something, okay? Because here's something real quick here. I have determined that when COVID is mostly behind us, I'm in Missouri. There's the Katy Trail. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Katy Trail. Okay, it's basically 285 miles of its old railroad trail, but they've turned it into hiking trail. Okay, all right. I want to, on my own, I wanted to walk the whole thing. I probably will not, but I have carved out a chunk of it that will take me about a week to do, front and back, by myself. And I have done these. See, I'm a very, very small patch on you on this. I used to go camping by myself. I go bouldering by myself. I would do those things, but I never would dream of doing what you've done, however, which is to actually cross the ocean by yourself in a boat. What possessed you? When did this happen? If you could just give us a couple of details on this, I'm just dying to know more about it.
Well, the question's unanswerable. I haven't a clue, right? I mean, why do you like chocolate ice cream? Who the hell knows? But what was happening is I was in Alaska and I was skiing with a buddy up on this ridge. And this is all backcountry skiing. And, we were in the clouds. You could hardly see a thing. And my buddy he'd done 2 tours in Vietnam. He was his ex-Marine. And, we didn't know about PTSD back then, but that's what he had. And he hadn't cut his hair since mustering out of the Marines. It was down to his waist, right? And he lived on a little boat, a 27-foot fiberglass boat down in the harbor in Juneau. And we're skiing down this ridge, and I say, "Hey, Don, what are you gonna do with the boat? Where are you gonna go sailing her?" And I was figuring, he'd sail her to the next village or something. And he says, "I'm gonna sail her into the South Pacific." And I said, "You can do that?" I had no idea, right? He said, "Sure, no problem." So I said, "Well, let's get off this ridge." So I got off this ridge really quick, and I went down to the library, and I found the sailing section of the library. I had never in my life been in the sailing section of the library, right? And I get this fat old book by a man named Eric Hiscock. He and his wife Susan had sailed around the world in the 50s, back when it was really exciting. And I read that book like a thriller. I did not sleep. I mean, it was like 600 pages of really dense of all this, 1950s technology, which wouldn't do you a damn bit of good today. And I was hooked. At that point, there was no choice. I had no choice. It was like God leaned out of the clouds and hit me on the side of the head with a 2x4 and said, "You're going sailing, boy. Don't turn back." Yeah. And, I'd been on a sailboat before, but the highest position I'd ever gotten to was just keep out of the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't have a faintest idea what I was doing.
How big a boat was it?
25 foot.
25 foot
Wooden boat. Yeah.
Wooden boat, sails. I assume maybe a trolling motor if you needed it. Is that it?
No, it didn't have a motor, but I put an outboard on the back so I could dink around in harbors and things. But
yeah, right. Okay, right. And how long were you out?
4 years.
4 years.
37,000 miles.
Now, have you written extensively about that in a book or anything, telling that whole tale? And if you have, forgive me if I missed that. But...
No, I haven't. That's actually the next project. I figured it's about time to write that. But, I'll tell you, I gave a talk to the Explorers Club in New York City.
I watched a portion of it.
Oh, you did? It didn't keep you, huh?
Well, I got cut off when it was time for the interview. I was like, oh, shoot, I should have watched this earlier. I got to the puking.
You got to the puking. So you got to the second day on the boat. Well, if you would just put that link in your show notes for your crew. So I did give a talk to the Explorers Club about the trip, right? And it's, if I ever get to finishing writing a book about it, that's the introduction. That's the trailer to the book.
Oh man, that is fantastic, Russell. I have scratch the surface of things I'd love to talk to you about. What I love, folks, when I do these interviews is, and if you listen to the show, you'll see this happens fairly often, but is to meet a writer who is not so consumed just with their book, but with life and talking about life and going around and talking about the aspects of life that lead to good fiction and good reading and good adventures. And sir, I doff my cap to you. I am so impressed. I've got another couple of books to add to my stack on my bedside table now. And when that book comes out about your exploits on the high seas, please consider coming back and talking to us, would you?
Oh, you take a sailor as opposed to a mystery writer?
Absolutely, I would. Are you kidding me? This is fantastic. No, I've always wanted to do the same thing, but I don't have the guts to go out by myself, and I've got a 12-year-old daughter who would not allow it. But I'll tell you this. If we want to learn more about Russell Heath, we just need to go to russellheathauthor.com. And it's a very comprehensive site. We've got everything you need to know. We have links to buy your books, and I will include that. Plus, I will include that YouTube in the show notes. Normally, folks, if you go to mgopod.com, you know I always have a YouTube link to the interviews that at least has an excerpt or two. Instead of that, I think it'll be really interesting to put this talk you gave to the Explorers Club in there. So again, Rens Crossing. Where would you want them to go? To Amazon, right? That's the place you want them to go, right? Or does it matter?
Anywhere they can buy the book. Yeah, Amazon, their local bookstore.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you so very much for taking time to join us here on Mysterious Goings On.
Hey, thank you, Alex. It's been a lot of fun.
All right, folks. It has been a lot of fun for me, too. Don't forget, check the show notes at mgopod.com. We got a lot more coming your way before 2020 hopefully sloughs away into the night, and we'll just enjoy it by reading great works by people like Russell Heath. Okay, until next time, keep reading.